When you're thinking about racial realities, you're really thinking about the racialization uh, uh, as the formation of a new racial identity in which new ideological boundaries of difference are drawn around a formerly unnoticed group of people. Right? You have to keep in mind that racial categories change over time. That's part of the social construction thing that we talked about earlier. If you look at the census, the categories of races change very frequently. In 2000, which was the first year in which respondents were allowed to select one or more race in the racial category, prior to 2000, respondents were forced to select only one race, even if they would describe themselves as bi or multiracial. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. For example, there is no set regulation for determining racial identity. A person may have ancestry from mixed descent, but may not identify with that descent. Or a person who has been born in the United States and whose parents and grandparents were also born in the United States might classify him or herself as Cuban because a grandparent was from Cuba. So racial categories are flexible. A recent example of racialization is the anti-Muslim backlash since 9/11. Being a Muslim is linked in the minds of Americans to being Arab. So anyone who looks Arab, for men, it's often linked to skin color and facial hair, and perhaps even clothing. And for women, it's often linked to the use of a headscarf. It is thought that they are Muslim and therefore anti-American. The world in the United States changed for Arab Americans fundamentally post 9/11. We are a society that likes to see people by the color of their skin and identify them based on certain characteristics, and then stereotype them based on those characteristics. And so anybody that looked Muslim, our first reaction is just to think of them as a terrorist. They could be the nicest people in the world, but our knee-jerk reaction, the one that we have been um, uh, conditioned to favor, is this person or these people are a threat. I'd like you to take the time to check out Janan Reed's interview, and it discusses her research on experience of Muslims in the United States. In this interview, she talks about the difference between being Arab, which is ethnicity, and being Muslim, which is a religion. She notes that in the United States, most Muslims are not Arab, they are South Asian. Most Arabs in the United States are not Muslim, they're Christian. Did you know that? Most people probably don't know that. Most assume that if they look Muslim, they are Muslim. So check out the video, and yeah, we'll talk more about it over time. We need to talk about the differences between race and ethnicity. Race is imposed usually based on physical differences. It's hierarchical, it's exclusive, and it's unequal. Ethnicity is voluntary, self-defined. It's non-hierarchical, fluid, cultural, and not so closely linked with power differences. And ethnicity becomes racialized when it is subsumed under a forced label, a racial marker, or otherness. The Amish, for instance, are a distinct ethnic group in American society, linked by a common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are also white. The Jewish people, on the other hand, contrary to what Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, are an ethnic group, not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they are not inextricably linked. There's a concept called symbolic ethnicity, which is ethnicity that is individualistic in nature and without real social cost for the individual. You might have a friend who has no idea that she was Irish until St. Patrick's Day, when she proudly displays her ethnicity. This ethnicity may not impact the day-to-day lives of Irish people or people of Irish descent, but it becomes relevant in this particular occasion. This would be an example of symbolic identity. I come from St. Louis, and one of their favorite holidays is St. Patty's Day. And everybody comes out and shows they're Irish. Whites who explore and express an affinity for their European roots can be said to be adopting a symbolic ethnicity as well. That makes them feel good about their heritage, and it's something they can focus on and express when they choose to. It really isn't an identity that they must assume all the time. So by claiming connections to it, they really they aren't taking any risks or anything like that. Another important concept is pluralism. In the context of race and ethnicity, this refers to the presence and engaged coexistence of numerous distinct groups in one society, with no one group being in the majority. Pluralism not only permits racial and ethnic variation within one society, it actually encourages people to embrace diversity, to exchange the traditional melting pot image for maybe a salad bowl. At the core of multiculturalism is tolerance of racial and ethnic differences. This, of course, is not the case in the United States. We still are under the auspices of assimilation. So you have to shed the cultural characteristics of your racial heritage and your ethnic heritage and become more like an American. Another concept that's important is segregation, which is the legal or social practice of separating people on the basis of their race or ethnicity. Segregation was the official policy in the United States, particularly in the South, until the 1960s. Stop for a minute, folks, and think about what that means. Segregation was the official policy in the United States until the 1960s. So, for example, in the U.S. South, up to the 1960s, not only did blacks live in separate neighborhoods, they were restricted to coloreds-only sections of buses, parks, restaurants, and even drinking fountains. And the atrocious behavior exhibited by white people, dominant white people, and the pain and suffering endured by people of color is appalling. When you look at our history, there's no other way that you can walk away and say anything but white people were appalling. And despite being illegal for over 40 years, there's still ample evidence of segregation in the United States, particularly in schools, housing, and prisons. The number of black males and Latino males in our prison systems is overrepresented compared to the number of white males in our prison system. There are 4 ways that groups respond to oppression, and they are withdrawal, passing, acceptance, and resistance. Acceptance and resistance can actually be closely linked. As members of an oppressed group, they might appear to accept their subordinate position while internally they feel enormous resentment. Overt collective resistance can take the form of revolution, whether that revolution is nonviolent, violent, protests, or riots. That's something that the movement itself is going to discuss. A lot of times violence is an organic result of the loss of control of a crowd. A lot of times it's planned by both sides, by the resistance and by those that are trying to exhibit social control. So when you're responding to domination, your best first step is almost always nonviolent civil disobedience. Once you start bringing violence to the debate, to the discussion, the other side, which possesses the only legitimate use of violence in society, will come full force. Other concepts: prejudice, discrimination. Prejudice refers to negative thoughts and feelings, whereas discrimination is negative acts against people. It's important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an internal evaluation, and discrimination is action. So prejudice is thinking you don't like a person. Discrimination is not hiring them because you don't like them. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it's important to know that that's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced, yet not discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate, yet not be prejudiced. For instance, a manager doesn't hire Chinese people because other people in the office don't like Chinese people, although the manager doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, and racism change over time. While overt racism is, for the most part, considered unacceptable in the United States today, there is a new kind of racism on the rise in America, and it focuses on cultural and national differences rather than racial ones. Many people argue that the new racism is even more dangerous, although overt racism is definitely problematic, or at least it can be easily seen and pointed out. This became the case in the United States in this past election. Nationalism drove the election of Donald Trump, and we as a nation are going to really have to think about what that means. Of course, race and wealth are linked. Wealth gaps exist between whites and minority groups in America, and public policies formulated to address white, non-white disparities have not really paid much close attention to the legacies of racism. You might remind yourself about Max Weber's ideas of life chances, that are opportunities in life are different depending on the class into which you are born. Class is extremely important. And if you're born into the lower class, the possibility of you making it out are difficult.